not an overnight coup. So too has been the destruction of the Canadian media, a steady process from the 1970s. It started with Conrad. Well, you go back to a royal commission in Canadian media. The commissioner was Tom Kent. I don't know how you remember Tom Kent. Great report that came out in the early 1980s that said the degree of corporate control over the Canadian media was, in his words, monstrous. In a Royal Commission report, too few people own too much of the media. That was before Conrad Black got going. Actually, Conrad Black used the appendices from that report to look up the names of local dailies and started buying them all up. True story. So 42 major national papers are owned by Post Media. So, and that includes all the dailies in BC. The Globe and Mail and CTV National, CTV is a network, are both owned by Bell Media, which is Bell, BCE. The Shaw Cable owns Global and a bunch of radio stations. About 5 big corporations own all the English media in Canada. The CBC is our public broadcaster, but terrified of losing all its funding. And the Quebec media, Quebecor, which is part of Sun, the best newspaper in Canada, probably the Island Times. But the second best newspaper in Canada is probably Le Devoir. Terribly small, but really, if you read French, really worth reading. We have terrible lack of capacity, courage, independence in the national media. Another thing that people don't realize is that Stephen Harper personally has gotten a number of reporters fired. Those stories are well known in the Canadian media. They know who's gotten fired by Stephen Harper and when and why. 2 different reporters in New Brunswick were fired over one story. The editor of the paper and the reporter who published the story. You probably wouldn't even imagine that 2 people could have been fired for this. The story that Stephen Harper pocketed the communion wafer when he went to Romeo of Bosnia. 2 people fired. Well, when you're fired, it's pretty traumatic. A prime minister who gets media fired, now it's not as bad as, they're not, swimming with the fishes, as people say, but they're fired. It's bad. Michael Harris is a reporter. He was fired from Sun Media when he began to question the F-35s in his column during the election campaign of 2011. And then he had a nationally syndicated radio show, and he was fired from that. And people, I won't tell you how they did it, but people from the Prime Minister's office made sure he knew that they got him fired. So our national media is both fewer reporters, less well-resourced, but the worst thing is they're scared. The best thing that, and I'm grateful, very, very grateful to the voters of Saanich-Gulf Islands, is you've given me a job where I'm not scared. Because Harper can't, only you can fire me.